In late 2006, the executives of the Ford Motor Company walked into a boardroom in New York City and committed the ultimate corporate indignity. They were desperate. They were bleeding billions of dollars a year. And they needed cash. Massive, unprecedented amounts of cash to secure the largest corporate loan in the history of American business. They had to pledge everything they owned as collateral. They mortgaged their sprawling factories. They mortgaged their proving grounds. They mortgaged their patents, their inventory, and their office buildings. But the banks demanded more. To finalize the $23.6 billion loan, the executives were forced to hand over the legal rights to the iconic blue oval Ford logo itself. It was a devastating humiliation. If this proud, century-old automaker defaulted on the loan, the banks would literally own their name. They had bet their entire identity, their entire legacy, and their entire future on a single, terrifying roll of the dice. Wall Street analysts thought they were completely insane. Taking on that much debt for a struggling manufacturing company seemed like financial suicide. It looked like the final, chaotic flailing of a dying dinosaur. But exactly 2 years later, the global economy collapsed. The Great Recession wiped out the credit markets overnight. General Motors ran out of cash and went bankrupt. Chrysler ran out of cash and went bankrupt. They both had to beg the United States government for a massive taxpayer bailout just to survive. But Ford didn't. Ford stood entirely alone. They weathered the greatest financial storm since the Great Depression without taking a single cent of government bailout money. The mechanism behind their survival wasn't just a lucky trip to the bank. It was a psychological masterclass in organizational destruction and rebirth. It is a framework of radical transparency, extreme focus, and counterintuitive supply chain strategy that fundamentally rewired how a modern corporation functions. We are going to reveal exactly what that framework is and how you can apply it to your own enterprise a little later in this breakdown. First, we need to examine the sickness. We need to look at the bloated, toxic, and deeply broken culture that pushed this iconic company to the absolute brink of extinction. So how did the most dysfunctional automaker in Detroit manage to anticipate the apocalypse, restructure its entire global operation, and engineer the most spectacular corporate turnaround of the 21st century? That is the exact question we are answering today. To understand the sheer magnitude of the miracle, you must first understand the depth of the rot. Let's go back to the late 1990s and the early 2000s. On paper, Ford was making money. Lots of it. They were riding the massive wave of the American SUV craze. Vehicles like the Ford Explorer and the Ford Expedition were practically printing cash. Gas was incredibly cheap. Profit margins on large trucks and SUVs were astronomical. But beneath the surface of these massive profits, the foundation of the company was completely hollow. Ford was not functioning as a single, unified corporation. It was functioning as a collection of heavily armed, warring fiefdoms. Ford North America hated Ford Europe. Ford Europe hated Ford Asia. Every single division operated in a complete vacuum, stubbornly refusing to share resources, engineering, or design. This regional arrogance created an operational nightmare. Consider the humble door handle. In a rational company, engineers design one excellent door handle and put it on multiple cars to save money. At Ford, the European engineers demanded their own door handles. The American engineers demanded theirs. At one point, Ford was purchasing and manufacturing over 100 different types of steering wheels for their various vehicles. They were spending billions of dollars unnecessarily duplicating basic engineering tasks across the globe. There were no economies of scale. There was only ego. And the ego was driven by a profoundly toxic corporate culture. Inside the glass house, Ford's world headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan, executives did not work together. They actively plotted against one another. Performance reviews were brutal and stacked on a curve. Executives knew that to move up the ladder, they had to pull someone else down. Information was hoarded like currency. If a project was failing, the absolute worst thing a manager could do was admit it. You hid the problem. You buried the data. You prayed that you would get promoted to a different department before the project finally exploded, so you could blame your successor. It was a culture of institutionalized lying. This toxic environment was exacerbated by a strategy of massive, undisciplined expansion. Under former CEO Jacques Nasser, Ford decided that just selling Ford vehicles wasn't prestigious enough. They wanted to dominate global luxury. So they went on a massive shopping spree. They bought Volvo. They bought Land Rovers. They bought Jaguar. They bought Aston Martin. They combined them into a massive division called the Premier Automotive Group. It was an unmitigated disaster. Instead of generating massive profits, these luxury brands became a black hole for capital. Ford was pouring billions of dollars into propping up Jaguar and Land Rover, starving their core brand of the research and development money it desperately needed. The quality of Ford vehicles began to plummet. Their cars were boring, unreliable, and completely uncompetitive against the rising tide of highly efficient Japanese imports from Toyota and Honda. Then the easy money stopped. The early 2000s brought a mild recession. Gas prices began to steadily creep up. The invincible American SUV market began to soften. And the deeply hidden structural flaws of the Ford Motor Company were suddenly exposed to the light of day. They began losing money at a terrifying rate. By 2005, the situation was critical. The company was hemorrhaging cash. Their credit rating was downgraded to junk status. Bill Ford, the great-grandson of Henry Ford, was the CEO at the time. He loved the company deeply. But he looked at the warring executives, the bloated bureaucracy, and the billions of dollars evaporating from the balance sheet, and he realized a profound, terrifying truth. He could not fix this. The culture of Ford was so deeply entrenched, so thoroughly poisoned, that no internal executive could possibly untangle the mess. An insider would just play the same political games. They needed an outsider. They needed someone who didn't care about the politics of Detroit. Bill Ford began a secret, desperate search for a new CEO. He courted heavily in the tech sector and the industrial sector. Most executives took one look at Ford's financials and ran the other way. But he finally found a willing candidate in an entirely different industry. His name was Alan Mulally. He was not a car guy. He was an aeronautical engineer. He was the executive who had just finished turning around Boeing's commercial airplane division after the devastating collapse of the aviation market following September 11th. When Bill Ford announced in September 2006 that an airplane guy was taking over the Ford Motor Company, the Detroit media openly mocked the decision. They claimed automotive manufacturing was too complex, too unique for an outsider to understand. They placed bets on how quickly Mulally would be chewed up and spat out by the vicious Dearborn bureaucracy. But Mulally didn't care about the noise. He understood complex manufacturing. He understood union labor. But most importantly, he understood organizational psychology. This brings us to the dip in the J-curve. The moment of maximum friction. When Alan Mulally arrived in Dearborn, he immediately instituted a radical new management protocol. It was called the Business Plan Review, or BPR. Every Thursday morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, the top executives of the company were required to meet in a secure conference room. No assistants were allowed. No cell phones. No side conversations. The rules were incredibly simple, but completely foreign to the Ford culture. Mulally projected a massive spreadsheet on the wall. Each executive was responsible for presenting a slide detailing the status of their specific division. And they had to color-code their progress. Green meant everything was on track. Yellow meant there was an issue, but there was a plan to fix it. Red meant the project was failing, and they had no solution. For the first few weeks, the BPR meetings were a masterclass in corporate delusion. Ford was scheduled to lose $17 billion that year. It was the largest annual loss in the company's 100-year history. Factories were idling. Quality was plummeting. Yet, week after week, the executives walked into the BPR meeting and presented rows of perfectly green slides. Every single executive was terrified to show a red slide. In the old Ford culture, a red slide was a career death sentence. It meant you were weak. It meant you were a target. So they lied. They smiled, presented their green slides, and watched the company burn to the ground. Mullally knew they were lying. He knew he had to break the fear. Week after week, he stopped the presentations. He looked at the executives and calmly stated the obvious. "We are going to lose $17 billion this year," he said. "Is there anything that is not going well?" Silence. No one moved. Finally, a young executive named Mark Fields decided to test the system. Fields was in charge of the Americas division. He was overseeing the launch of a highly anticipated new vehicle, the Ford Edge. But there was a massive problem. The automated tailgate actuator, the motor that opened the trunk, was failing in testing. It was a critical quality issue. The launch of the vehicle had to be delayed. In the old culture, Fields would have launched the car anyway, let the customers deal with the broken trunks, and blamed the engineering department later. Instead, on a Thursday morning, Fields walked into the BPR meeting. The spreadsheet appeared on the wall. And next to the Ford Edge launch, there was a bright, glaring red box. The room instantly froze. Executives literally stopped breathing. They stared at the red box, then looked at Alan Mulally, waiting for the execution. They fully expected Mulally to scream at Fields, fire him on the spot, and replace him with someone who could deliver a green slide. Mulally looked at the red slide. He looked at Mark Fields. And then Alan Mulally started clapping. He stood up, applauded, and said, "Mark, that is great visibility. Thank you for that." The room was stunned. Mulally then turned to the rest of the table. "Now what can we do to help Mark fix this?" Suddenly, an engineering executive offered to send a team of specialists to look at the actuator. A supply chain executive offered to contact a different vendor for the motor. Within 5 minutes, the collective brainpower of the Ford Motor Company was actively solving a problem instead of hiding it. That single, simple moment destroyed the toxic culture of Ford forever. The executives realized that Mulally wasn't lying. He actually wanted the truth. He established a new corporate mantra. You have a problem, but you are not the problem. The following Thursday, the spreadsheet was a sea of red and yellow. The executives finally admitted how broken the company truly was. The truth had finally been unlocked. But the truth was terrifying. Once Mulally saw the actual, unfiltered data, he realized the company was completely out of cash. Their operational burn rate was catastrophic. They were months away from insolvency. Mulally needed a financial runway to execute his turnaround strategy. He needed a massive cushion to weather the restructuring. This is when the monumental $23.6 billion loan was engineered in late 2006. Mulally ordered his financial team to borrow every single dollar they could possibly find. He wanted to empty the banks. He famously told his team to borrow down to the bare walls. When the banks demanded the blue oval logo as collateral, the Ford family was sickened. But Mulally convinced them it was the only way. If they didn't pledge the logo, the company would die and the logo would be worthless anyway. They signed the papers. The cash hit the balance sheet. It was the most brilliant, perfectly timed financial maneuver in modern industrial history. Because less than 18 months later, the subprime mortgage crisis triggered a global financial meltdown. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The global credit markets completely froze solid. Nobody was lending money to anyone. Period. General Motors and Chrysler, who had not built a massive liquidity cushion, suddenly found themselves completely unable to fund their daily operations. They couldn't pay their suppliers. They couldn't pay their workers. They hit a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. But Ford had $23 billion sitting comfortably in the bank. The loan bought them time. But time is useless if you don't have a strategy to fix the underlying business. Mulally implemented a radical, unifying vision for the entire global operation. He called it One Ford. The strategy was blindingly simple, but executionally agonizing. First, they had to subtract the noise. Mulally looked at the premier automotive group, the luxury brands that Jacques Nasser had bought, and realized they were a massive distraction. Ford didn't know how to run Aston Martin or Jaguar. They only knew how to run Ford. So in a fire sale that shocked the industry, Mulally sold them all. He sold Aston Martin. He sold Jaguar and Land Rover to Tata Motors in India. He eventually sold Volvo to Geely in China. He stripped the company down to its absolute core. Ford and Lincoln. Nothing else. Second, they had to destroy the regional fiefdoms. Mulally ordered the complete globalization of the engineering and manufacturing process. If Ford was going to build a compact car like the Focus, they were no longer going to build a European version, an American version, and an Asian version. They were going to design one world-class platform, use the exact same parts, and build it for the entire globe. This achieved massive, unprecedented economies of scale. Suddenly, instead of buying 10,000 door handles from 50 different suppliers, they were buying 10 million door handles from one supplier. Their procurement costs plummeted. Their manufacturing efficiency skyrocketed. But as Ford was ruthlessly executing this brilliant turnaround, the apocalyptic reality of 2008 arrived at their doorstep. The American auto industry was collapsing. GM and Chrysler were practically begging the federal government for a bailout. The media narrative was vicious. The big three automakers were viewed as dinosaurs who had built terrible gas-guzzling cars and were now demanding taxpayer money to save them from their own stupidity. In November 2008, the CEOs of GM, Chrysler, and Ford were called to testify before the United States Congress. This was the ultimate public relations minefield. The CEOs of GM and Chrysler, displaying a shocking lack of self-awareness, flew to Washington, D.C. in their massive, multi-million-dollar corporate private jets to beg for taxpayer money. The optics were absolutely catastrophic. The media eviscerated them. Alan Mulally did not fly in a private jet. He got into a Ford Escape Hybrid, a vehicle that perfectly showcased Ford's pivot toward fuel efficiency, and he physically drove it the 500 miles from Dearborn to Washington, D.C. When he sat before the congressional committee, he delivered a message that completely stunned the politicians and the media. He looked at the microphone and clearly stated that the Ford Motor Company did not need a bailout. They had sufficient liquidity. They were executing their turnaround plan. They were surviving. But then he did something truly counterintuitive. He begged Congress to bail out his direct competitors. He passionately argued that the government must give billions of dollars to General Motors and Chrysler. Why would a CEO advocate for the survival of his biggest rivals? Why not let them go bankrupt and steal all of their market share? This brings us to the core insight, the absolute secret behind the mechanics of heavy manufacturing. Mulally understood the invisible geometry of the automotive supply chain. Ford does not build cars. They assemble them. The actual parts, the seats, the electronics, the brakes, the glass, are built by thousands of independent suppliers scattered across the country. These suppliers are deeply fragile businesses, and they rely on massive volume to survive. A company that manufactures car seats doesn't just sell to Ford. They sell to Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Mulally knew that if GM and Chrysler went bankrupt, the massive drop in production volume would instantly bankrupt the thousands of suppliers that supported them. And if the suppliers went bankrupt, Ford's assembly lines would immediately grind to a halt. It wouldn't matter that Ford had $23 billion in the bank. You cannot sell a car that doesn't have a steering wheel. The American automotive industry was an inextricably linked, symbiotic organism. A contagion in one part of the body would inevitably kill the whole. Mullally wasn't being altruistic. He was being ruthlessly pragmatic. He was protecting his own supply chain by advocating for his enemies. Congress eventually approved the bailouts for GM and Chrysler. The supply base stabilized. And when the dust finally settled, when the economy began to slowly recover in 2009 and 2010, the landscape of the American auto industry had fundamentally changed. The American consumer was furious about the bailouts. They resented the taxpayer money given to failing corporations. But they remembered that Ford had stood alone. They remembered the blue oval had survived on its own merits. This generated an incalculable amount of brand goodwill. Millions of Americans actively chose to buy a Ford Fusion or a Ford F-150 purely as a reward for the company's financial independence. But they didn't just buy a story. They bought fundamentally better vehicles. Because of the One Ford strategy, the cars rolling off the assembly line were the highest quality products the company had built in decades. They were efficient, stylish, and globally competitive. By 2010, Ford reported a net income of $6.6 billion, their highest profit in over a decade. The stock price, which had fallen to roughly $1 a share in the dark days of 2008, began a massive, multi-year rally. And most symbolically, in 2012, credit rating agencies officially upgraded Ford's debt back to investment grade. The banks formally released the collateral. The Ford family got the blue oval back. This brings us to the aha moment. When analysts review the survival of Ford, they often point to the massive loan. They claim that Mullally was simply lucky to borrow the money before the credit markets froze. But capital is not a strategy. Capital is just oxygen. If you pump $23 billion of oxygen into a deeply toxic, siloed, and fundamentally broken organization, you don't fix the organization. You just make it burn faster. The true secret of the Ford turnaround was not financial leverage. It was cultural leverage. By instituting the business plan review and clapping for a red slide, Alan Mullally completely destroyed the corporate silos. He weaponized the truth. When an organization is transparent, when executives stop fighting each other and start fighting the actual problems, a company can survive almost any external shock. Ford survived the Great Recession because Mullally forced 100,000 employees to look at exactly the same spreadsheet, admit their failures, and row in exactly the same direction. However, achieving that level of radical transparency across a massive global organization is almost impossible if you are relying on outdated tools. When Alan Mullally arrived at Ford, his biggest enemy wasn't Toyota. It was hidden information. Data was trapped in isolated regional servers, buried in endless email chains, and obscured by executives trying to protect their own empires. When you're scaling a business or trying to execute a complex turnaround, operational silos will destroy your momentum. You cannot fix a problem if your teams don't have a centralized, brutally honest view of the actual workflow. That is exactly why modern, high-growth organizations rely on Asana. Asana is the ultimate work management platform designed specifically to eradicate organizational silos. Instead of letting your engineering team, your marketing team, and your finance team operate in isolated vacuums, Asana centralizes your entire company's goals and daily operations into a single, highly visible hub. If you want to apply the One Ford methodology to your own business, you need a system that enforces clarity. Asana allows you to build customized workflows, track cross-functional projects in real time, and ensure that every single employee knows exactly what they are doing, why they are doing it, and whether the project is fundamentally on track. It is the digital equivalent of Alan Mullally's BPR spreadsheet. It removes the fear of reporting data by making transparency the default state of your entire organization. You can start breaking down your internal silos and unifying your global teams right now by clicking the link in the description to try Asana for free. When you strip away the massive manufacturing plants, the congressional hearings, and the billion-dollar loans, the Ford turnaround reveals a profound, undeniable truth about human organization. You cannot fix a secret. If your culture punishes honesty, your employees will give you perfectly green spreadsheets while the foundation of your company collapses beneath your feet. Alan Mulally saved an American titan not by being a ruthless dictator, but by being an aggressively supportive auditor of reality. He demanded the truth, he protected the people who delivered it, and he focused the collective genius of a 100-year-old company onto a single, unifying goal. They borrowed down to the bare walls. They bet the blue oval. And because they finally stopped lying to themselves, they won it all back. If you learned something new, hit the like button and subscribe for more strategy breakdowns. And let us know in the comments, what company's strategy should we unlock next?